you know, I mean, I read a little interview you granted maybe sometimes ago, and you had said something about, which I'm paraphrasing, about the continuity of history.
Mhm.
You know, and in that poem, you began to talk about centuries, a millennial, you know, men, women, and animals, and all of those things, and it just feels like one continuum. I guess I want to ask you about your relationship to time,
Mhm.
because in your poems, it seems as if you always sidestep in time, that you refuse to treat it. I mean, I might be wrong, as this. It's almost as if you refuse to accept that 1,000 years ago is so vastly different from now, you know?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I wanted you to talk about that. You sidestep time, you treat history as this one long room of interlinked rooms.
Well, human history isn't all that long,
Mm.
particularly with regard to recorded history and history of which we can have any real sense. That's a pretty short stretch of time. And you know, when I first fell in love with poetry, it was through Sylvia Plath, etc. But when I first found a body of poetry that I really loved, it was through this book called The Silver Poets of the 16th Century. It was an everyman library book, and it had like Walter Raleigh, etc. And you know, so it was these poets from like 400 years prior,
Wow.
and I just really, really loved that stuff. It really electrified me, you know, as the Plath had. And since I spent so much of my time sort of thinking about that time period, and you know, fell in love with medieval poetry and poetry that happened, you know, 17th century poetry, thinking about this kind of window, that was where my head was at for a really long time. And that's, you know, 400, 500 or so, 600 years previously. And so if the thing that I'm trying to make today has roots of which I'm very conscious, its primary roots are in, you know, a time period 400, 500 years ago, but then, you know, other roots are thousands of years ago. Then it's hard to think of history as, you know, something. It's hard to think of something that happened in the mid 19th century as very long ago. You know, I mean, one way to think about it is, you know, the current presidential candidates, both of whom are 80 or about. If you think about it and consider the age of America, they have been alive for a third of the time that America has existed. It's 240 years old. They're 80 years old. So history is not, it's just not that long.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I really love that. Increase the stage.
Yeah, yeah.
One thought of the time.
Yeah, it's when I realized that, I thought, oh wow.
Wow.
It just didn't seem
Wow.
real, but it is real.
That puts things in context in a marvelous way, you know. And I wanted to talk about, you've written this incredible memoir,
Oh, thank you.
which I love. I've read it. I deeply enjoyed it. I love that you did not give up lyrical language, you know. It was just I was thinking, oh my God, I can't imagine the kind of pressure, or maybe not, that Shane must have withstood from editors to keep to this voice in a memoir, you know. But I loved it so deeply.